Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm an enormous fan of Gilbert and Sullivan. But it only just struck me recently that I've never seen a good parody of Gilbert and Sullivan, and there are plenty of parodies out there. So whereas my favourite Savoy opera, Ruddigore, has the secondary title The Witch's Curse, when it comes to Gilbert and Sullivan parodies, the kitsch is worse. And I'd like to thank one Reverend Spooner for writing to me with that suggestion. Well, welcome to this edition of Musical Talk, and we are going to be talking about my favourite Savoy opera, which, as anyone who listens to Musical Talk regularly will know, is Ruddigore, or The Witch's Curse. Now, it's a show that I've reviewed and discussed on a number of occasions here on Musical Talk, but today we're going to be doing it within the context of melodrama, because if you've been listening to the last few episodes of Musical Talk, you'll be aware that we're running a 3-part episode look at the role of melodrama in musical theatre. 2 weeks ago, in episode 848, we looked at melodrama in theory. In last week's episode, we looked at melodrama in practice, and this week we're looking at melodrama inverted, in parody. And the absolute exemplar of a parody of melodrama in the world of musical theatre is Ruddigore by Gilbert and Sullivan. And the reason for that is W.S. Gilbert, who wrote the book as well as the libretto, the lyrics of the piece, was immersed in Victorian theatre and was one of the main drivers of trying to make drama in all its forms in the 19th century more respectable, not just morally, but in terms of its professionalism. He and a man called Thomas Hood almost invented the idea of the director as we understand it, and it is through his pincer movement of improving performance through direction and writing better quality drama that ushered in the era of George Bernard Shaw and the subsequent flowering of the Edwardian stage. We have a lot to be thankful to W.S. Gilbert for, not just in the world of musical theatre. But I digress. Because he was a man so immersed in the theatre from the entire Victorian age and was trying his hardest to improve it, he was a man who knew its weaknesses. And he knew that melodrama, whilst it served a role, and still persists to this day, as we've been exploring in the last 2 weeks' episodes, that it was not dramatically satisfying in terms of psychology or character development. And because he was a man of many talents, he had many tools available to him for trying to point this out. And Ruddigore, I think, is the flowering of that. He takes all the tropes of melodrama and then completely subverts them and inverts them. He makes them, as we now say, topsy-turvy. The two words probably most associated with W.S. Gilbert's theatrical worldview. To give you an example, in Sweeney Todd and the String of Pearls last week, the nominal hero is Mark Ingester, sometimes pronounced Mark Ingester, and he is a sailor. In the world of melodrama in the mid-19th century, a British sailor was always the hero, and so that was very much the case in Sweeney Todd. However, in Ruddigore, whilst Richard Dauntless, the sailor character, is paraded as a hero and is declared to be a hero, he is by far the most duplicitous character in the entire piece. The Sweeney Todd avatar, Sir Despard Murgatroyd, the bad baronet of Ruddigore, also subverts the role of a villain. In Victorian melodrama, a villain was a villain because they were a villain. There's not much more to it than that. In the case of Sir Despard, he's a character who states that he gets his daily crime done first thing in the morning so he can spend the rest of the day doing good. And of course, he also has a reason for being bad. He is not bad in himself. He has badness forced upon him by the Witch's Curse, the secondary title of the piece. And so it is with all the other characters. Our ingenue character, Rose Maybud, is incredibly manipulative and materialist. And she has no genuine fidelity to anyone except herself. And there's one song in the piece where she keeps changing her suitor depending on what they offer her in terms of material goods. And perhaps most stunningly of all, particularly for the Victorian era, which as we know was incredibly judgmental, Mad Margaret, the soubrette character if you like, does not live up to the stock role allocated to mad characters in Victorian melodrama. Being a mad character, a mad woman, normally represented a fallen woman, someone who had had sex outside of marriage, in other words. But of course Mad Margaret's great sadness is that her mind has been turned through chastity and genuine undying love. Of all the characters in Ruddigore, she is the one who is completely unblemished and sinless. And incidentally, that's a theme that W.S. Gilbert would return to on a number of occasions in his works, not just musicals. For a man we think of as being completely Victorian, there's lots of evidence that he believed society was unfair when it judged women for having sex outside marriage so harshly when it turned a blind eye to men doing so. However, that may be a discussion for another day. And so let's bring this back to what today's episode is going to be about. Well, in 2023, not only could you have seen Sweeney Todd and the String of Pearls at the Wilton's Music Hall in East London, the Wilton's Music Hall, of course, being the oldest surviving first-phase music hall building in the world, but you could also see a version of Ruddigore, both shows being Victorian, and the Wilton's Music Hall being perfectly suited for Victorian shows. They were both great delights, and it was wonderful to see both shows in literally a succession of about 3 or 4 weeks. Because one is the archetype of melodrama, and the other sends up melodrama. It was just happy circumstance that scheduled them so closely together. But it did give the discerning theatre-goer a really wonderful chance to immerse themselves in the tropes of Victorian drama and then see those tropes overturned. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today in this episode of Musical Talk, which is not just about Ruddigore, but acts as the third episode of our investigation into musical theatre and Victorian melodrama that we've been running here for the last 3 weeks. I saw this show with my good friend and fellow presenter Josh Clark, who had never seen Ruddigore before. And whilst Josh admits to being a fan of Gilbert and Sullivan, he is also honest that he does not know all the lore, L-O-R-E, and history. So I was very interested to hear his take on my favourite Savoy opera. So let's hear that now. Josh Clark and me talking about Ruddigore, or The Witch's Curse. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Josh, it always fills me with delight when I know that I'm going to be having a conversation with you, a delight which is only exceeded by the delight when that conversation starts. So this very moment is pretty much the apogee of my experience for the week.
My goodness. And you expect me to follow that with a similar grandiloquence, dare I say
damn it, I feel matched.
Wow, and would anyone believe that was unscripted?
For both of us.
Yes, indeed. Very good.
But it's nothing less than the truth, because actually I do really enjoy our conversations, and so it is a great pleasure for me today, because we're going to be talking about, well, my favourite Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, Ruddigore, or The Witch's Curse, which you and I saw together at the Wilton's Music Hall in East London, one of the oldest surviving original style musicals in the world. You've been before or not?
I hadn't been there before, no, so my first outing.
Well, I feel that we ought briefly to talk about it because it's a place which is possibly, I think, one of the most evocative theatrical venues in London. But do you want to describe it, and how did you respond to it?
Well, yeah, okay, let's start at the beginning.
Often a good place, I find.
Often a good place. And an enduring memory was us finding our way there and walking through the streets to get there. And then suddenly there's a few little signs, aren't there, pointing you in the right direction. But there's quite a narrow side street or alleyway.
It's called Grace's Alley, and it's a real survivor of that kind of sort of medieval warren of streets which is mostly swept away from London, but this hall is still in it. It's a pedestrianised road because it's never a car road or a coach. It was never a coach road. So it's a proper alley.
Yeah, and in that sense, I suppose that the theatrical experience, almost you could say, begins when you turn into that alleyway, doesn't it? And
Actually, that's true.
you're transported into somewhere else, and the traffic's gone, like you've mentioned, and yeah, it does feel a little bit like stepping back in time somewhat. So you get to the theatre, and you walk in, and it's quite a grand atrium, I suppose I would describe it as, all panelled from memory, and it's quite imposing staircase that we went up and down a few times to find our way, and yeah, a little bar to the side. But I think I remember remarking at the time that it probably had not been changed or altered or cobweb decluttered for about a century. But that's nice, because it matched the kind of production that we happened to be seeing on this particular day.
And that's absolutely true. And a bit later on, only a few weeks later, I went to see Sweeney Todd and the String of Pearls, the mid-Victorian 1847 adaptation of Sweeney Todd's original story as a melodrama, not the Stephen Sondheim. And once again, that kind of built-in Victorian evocation that comes from the building just sort of immediately launched the show into the context that it needed to be performed in, or performed in a space which gave it an extra oomph before it even started. It's like a free point. You're quite right about it being panelled, but there's also a sense of decrepitude about Wilton's, because it's been semi-restored. So actually there's quite a lot of brick walls without any kind of plaster or render, and there are old fireplaces which are just sort of boarded up or bricked up. Nothing's been moved. So you're right, what you're getting is an authentic space.
Yeah, and I observed that the director had been wanting to put this show on for many years, and felt that Wilton's was the perfect place for it, which links beautifully into our impression. We
don't disagree with that at all, I think. Now, we were lucky enough, we were sitting in the stall, so it's first generation musical, so actually it doesn't feel like a theatre per se, although it has a lot of trappings that we recognise in a theatre with a stage at the front, but there's not really a space for an orchestra, so they were sitting at one side.
On our side, which was excellent.
Well, yes, good choice, but by luck on our part. So we were quite close to the stage in the stalls, and they would have been on our right, which I suppose is stage left.
Stage left, yeah.
And all you've got is above us it's a rectangular hall, and then you've got one gallery. The circle is a square or rectangular circle raised on columns and poles. It's the rectangular nature of the room. It's basically a hall with a second level put in, which marks it out as being a first generation music hall. Because you don't expect that in a theatre. You expect it to be sort of semicircular or rounded, at least certainly in a traditional Victorian one. Later Victorian, Frank Matcham style. So, yes, I think it really did set up the atmosphere. Let's move on to Gilbert and Sullivan and Ruddigore. But first, I think I want to contextualise this piece within your appreciation of Gilbert and Sullivan. One of the many things I like about you, Josh, and there are millions, I shall recite them all later, but maybe off the record, is that you're, like me, a great fan of Gilbert and Sullivan. But you don't come from what I'm going to call the hereditary family hobby of Gilbert and Sullivan that many people do. As it happens, I don't either. I found them for myself, and then I absorbed the complete canon in all its forms and have been going to see it continually ever since. A lot of people are fans of Gilbert and Sullivan because their parents were and their grandparents were. It's often described as a hereditary hobby, which I think is marvellous. But I think, like me, you found it your own way, but you don't know all the pieces intimately. So what was your history with Ruddigore before we saw it together?
No, you're quite right. I don't have the metaphorical wall of ancestral adherence to Gilbert and Sullivan that many people do have. And it was university that saw me first dabble with these shows, and I think I'm probably about halfway through the back catalogue at the moment.
But not in chronological order?
No. Although my first one was, I say although, it may bear no resemblance at all, but I think my first one was The Sorcerer.
Oh, which is a good early one. It's their first full length.
Yeah. That's what I thought. Okay, yes. That's where I was going. I couldn't quite commit to saying that. Yeah. But no, there will certainly be some gaps. But in terms of Ruddigore itself, I knew nothing, actually. It was one that I probably needed to see next in terms of kind of the bigger names. So, yeah, I went in with very little prior knowledge. I think I knew that it was another Cornish-based one.
Yes, it is.
Which
set
is
in the fictional town of Red Herring.
That's right, of course. Don't try and find it. But yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it was good to come to a show without any preconceptions and just to try to work out what on earth was happening. And if we dip into it. May I?
Oh, please.
Right, yes.
That door's well and truly open. I'd love you to step through the threshold.
Wonderful. Well, I think we've probably got a very early talking point with this, because the characters entered the stage from some behind us, I think, didn't they? And
They did.
And going back to what we're saying about the whole environs of this theatre and creating a very Victorian atmosphere, well, the first thing you see is two very modern dressed people emerging, and they've entered a hotel, haven't they? And
Yes, this is over the overture, we should explain.
Yes.
Yeah, so they've done this thing where they've created a bit of new work to contextualise the story we're about to get. So, yes, exactly.
Yeah,
as you
well,
say.
it's a
It's
framing
people checking
device.
into a hotel, isn't it? Framing device, thank you. Very
yeah,
well,
because we do come back to that at the end.
Yes, briefly.
But it was quite clever, really, because it ends up being essentially period.
Yes.
But the conceit is that these people check into a hotel. It's a very strange place with,
Yes.
with some kind of brooding, silent caricatures. And
Very Jamaica Inn.
well, exactly. That's another nice Cornish link. And they get drugged, don't they, with the tea or something like that.
That's right. Basically, the staff
Yeah.
pass them all a Mickey Finn without them realising it,
That's
essentially.
it.
Yes, quite.
And they fall asleep and wake up in
Character.
character. It's very convenient. So by the time the overture's ended, we understand why everyone's dressed as they are, and away we go. But it's quite an engaging start, and nice to have something. I find it interesting that I personally am saying this, because, I love an overture, as we've discussed before, and I love to just listen to it and watch the orchestra. But actually, it was quite nice to see something happening over it, and to make use of that music. And there were little highlights in the music which were tied in with little bits of acting choreography, and it's a nice start.
I'm going to have to make an observation which has only just come to me here, which is, funnily enough, in the mid-Victorian period. So just, Ruddigore's 1887, I think. But it's set earlier. It's set sort of mid-Victorian era. In that mid-Victorian era, pantomime, as we understand it in Britain, was starting to metamorphose into using fairy stories, because up to that point it'd been using the opera dell'arte concept of the harlequin, the clown, the old man, Columbine, the heroine, if you like, set of stock characters, which is also a form of melodrama. And Ruddigore is the melodrama concept turned on its head, the topsy-turvy melodrama. Gilbert cocking a snook at that particular form, also set in the mid-Victorian at its heyday. Once again, Sweeney Todd, 1847. So all these connections, but up to that point, it'd been opera dell'arte in pantomime, and it would be a straight harlequinade, is what that story became known as, where Harlequin and Columbine outwit various people to get together. But in order to bring punters in, they started putting stories in the middle of it. And they used to take fairy stories, and there used to be something called the transformation scene, which of course we still see today. We now mean it to mean Cinderella gets transformed into the princess, and the coach gets the pumpkin gets transformed into the coach, or something of that nature. But actually, the transformation scene was that the silent stock characters of the opera dell'arte were bewitched in some way, and then those characters, for the middle of the pantomime, would then act out Jack and the Beanstalk or whatever fairy story they were doing. And so there was an avatar between the actor playing Harlequin would then play the hero, the actor playing Columbine would then play the heroine, the actor playing Clown would play the dame, as we'd recognise it, or what will become the dame. So you can see, basically, they were playing another character, then they transform back into the Harlequinade and go back. That, essentially, is a framing device. Now, what happened in the end is the Harlequinade was thrown away and we kept the fairy story, so that's modern pantomime. But actually, it's interesting, the framing device that we've just mentioned there is because each of the people checking into the hotel are obviously avatars for characters in the Ruddigore story proper, and they are transformed, in this case through being drugged, into them playing that character, and as you say, it then breaks at the end when there's a kind of, they're released.
Which is actually quite helpful for someone like me coming to Gilbert and Sullivan for the first time, and I'm sure I wouldn't have been alone in it, because you very easily understand the relationship between the characters in this very brief modern day-ish sketch that's drawn, and so it's very easy for you to then translate that into
who they
them.
are.
Yeah, exactly. In the
Well,
past.
you're right, because we had a young courting couple, we might say, checking into this hotel, and of course they then turn out to be the principal love interests in the Ruddigore story proper.
And the setting just allows for the key scenic device of the portraits and things, just because you're in this hotel straight away. It made sense, didn't it? When you were talking about the pantomime and those links just then, I was thinking of another kind of musical reference, and it's not the same thing, but it had a bit of a feel. almost of a Brigadoon. Just this.
I know what you mean.
This magical world that's there for a while, and then you step out of time, and kind of time is carrying on.
There's a portal to a different place.
Yeah.
Oh, do you know, that's very interesting as well. And there's a magical quality to that, isn't there? And there's also that sense you can get trapped in it in Brigadoon.
Yes.
Indeed. Through love. I hadn't thought of that, but actually that's, So it's playing on some universal concepts, that framing device. Now, I must say I'm not a fan of framing devices for a show, but I don't think needs them. So for me, I know Ruddigore well enough that I just thought, well, why aren't we just getting the overture? But actually, I didn't object to it. I'm not absolutely certain that it did much more than set up the characters in their Avatar modern-day versions. No. But it was something that brings people in, and also, I wonder if it means that. Do you think this is also part of a trend in theatre? That actually people are starting to be frightened, or directors are starting to be frightened of just plain old overtures, which is just music, or is that nonsense? There's no wrong answer.
No, it's hard to say, because it'd be very easy to say something along the lines of, well, do you get really good, proper
8-minute overtures
anymore? Yeah, it's very easy to immediately say no, but then I'm sure I'd be contradicted on many good examples of it. All I could probably say is that I really did enjoy this one, and perhaps for the fact that it did stand out as being different. I probably will need to go and see a maybe different more traditional Ruddigore, and then my
we
opinion
can
might
make
change.
This happen, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. But for this production, it seemed to work well, and actually, with them being whisked into this different world, go back again to the type of theatre we were in, it felt like the sort of place where that could almost happen as well.
Well, also, yes, because as we were saying, it's a place that's stopped in time itself, isn't it? So, yes, you're right. You don't need to do much to take you back to the mid-Victorian period when it was built. So, this is quite interesting.
And perhaps, again, another justification, although we have to make justifications for this thing, is that it was a very small cast.
Twas.
And so they don't have the luxury of being able to fill the stage with lots of interesting business between, a great ensemble. And so perhaps just using the slightly more limited resources, there is this story which can be carried by
a smaller number of people.
Yeah.
Yes, you make a very good point there. Once again, yes, you're right. So, the choruses were basically 3 women and 3 men, and they were doubling up not just characters but with the orchestra or band, I should probably say. Should we talk a little bit about the orchestra or band? I don't know which term to use, but it was quite small.
Yes.
And you spotted, there's a number of things that stood out for me, but you spotted something rather impressive. So I'm just going to talk about the thing that stood out for me, which is that the band were on the side of the stage, except for one member, who I think was described, she was given a character role of sort of a Madame de Parme. She was a violinist, and an excellent violinist, a proper top-notch violinist. She was dressed in a 1920s kind of costume with hair as well. So I don't know, this hotel where they're doing the Mickey Finns is actually the 20s going back to the 1850s. Right. That wasn't, for me, easy to tell, but what I would say is that she looked like she was part of a palm court orchestra, and that was the feeling I sort of got the impression they were trying to do. But she was a real addition to the piece, because she was in speech marks modern time, in the orchestra one step removed. So it's all quite Brechtian, and yet she was sort of commenting on through her facial expressions. Yeah. She wasn't just a brilliant violinist. She was a superb light comedian, although she didn't do anything but sit in her chair and sort of respond to what was happening. Every now and then one of the actors in character would then sort of interact with her as well. So there was that kind of very occasional moment. But she was a live editorial of, she was giving you comments. What you were getting from her is sort of facial commentary of what was happening. I've not seen that before. I thought it worked terribly well.
Yeah, you're right. It wouldn't be done very often, because you're almost crossing musical theatre genres, orchestral genres. I don't know, I'm making phrases up here, but we're all familiar with the very traditional, goodness me, the cast on the stage and the orchestra in the pit. That's the one extreme, or the actor-musician model, where it's all brought into the same space, and the music isn't just a soundtrack that happens to be there, but it's I suppose borrowing from the film world, it's the difference between something diegetic and non-diegetic.
Yeah, well, I'm absolutely with you on those framing.
Yeah. Whereas this, do you see what I mean? It crosses those because
It had its cake and eat it. I think.
Absolutely, yeah, because she is moving from the world of the music, which is separate and dark and shaded and at the side, into being an actual character. Now, it would not have worked as a device if she were just neutral with her face and just on the stage playing the music.
Yeah, it would just look like it wasn't enough room.
Yeah. But certainly, and again, I go back to the point, there wasn't an awful lot to look at because there weren't too many people there. So it was a quite clever directorial choice to have her in those sections.
Yeah, and of course she was always on stage. So even when she was not playing, and the eyes were moving and the facial expressions, you're right, because she also bulks up the cast just, as you say, by being there. Yes, I thought that was possibly one of the most interesting innovations in this.
And there were a few others, weren't there?
Indeed,
in the orchestra, in the band, who were popping on and popping off, and going between the pits, so to speak, and being on the stage. And I hadn't clocked it for a little while, and then you just see the doorway by the thing, and they're coming in and sitting in costume and then coming on.
Yes, a few hats make a lot of difference, don't they?
Yeah, but no, it's a good way of working, and we've talked about the economy of theatres before. It's a sensible, almost financial model of putting a show on, isn't it? To squeeze as much out of everyone as you possibly can.
To get it on at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I didn't think it suffered for it. The orchestra was small, but you noticed as well, I think, is it the green button?
Oh, yes. Well...
And this is where your brilliance comes in. I didn't spot this at all.
Well, it's coming back to me, though, because you said green button, and then I was thinking, okay, well, that would signify click track. But it was even a little bit more than just a metronome to keep everyone in time, although it was part of that. But the sound designer had done a job with all sorts of thunder effects and
percussive stuff.
Yeah, and other noises which tied into plot and was linked to what the actors were doing, but which also had to happen at very particular moments, didn't it, in the music? So yeah, sometimes if you had some of the band on stage, there's only maybe 3 of them playing at certain points.
Indeed.
But they had to be absolutely on it, and some of the songs really raced along.
Well, that's what Ruddigore is known for, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Oh, right, okay. Yes. It felt to me like even if they were meant to be fast, perhaps they were particularly fast in this, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. But they had to be. There was absolutely no room for let-up because the whole sound design would have fallen apart.
Well, yes, and I was impressed. Once you pointed it out to me, I was impressed by the musical director's dexterity because, as you say, he was conducting and playing and pressing buttons. And I don't know how many hands you've got, but that's more than I've got. And as you say, he's got people coming in and out at the same time. And they were producing enough sound for it to fill a full auditorium. Yeah,
and the musical director did a good job actually, because it was a very full piano part that he was playing, but I think he was very strategic with the other orchestral instruments that were used to pad it out, because it didn't sound like someone just playing the piano.
No, it really didn't.
Which you do get sometimes in GNS versions, don't you? So it was quite a nice medium.
I think I've told this story before, but it's always worth telling. This is an anecdote. I went to see a version of The Mikado at a venue in Scotland as part of the Edinburgh Fringe many years ago now. But the entire score was being played on the piano. Unfortunately, the piano in the venue was not up to snuff, and it had a couple of duff notes. And by duff notes, I mean they didn't play. So there were like 3 notes missing right in the middle, and 1 or 2 others which were not tuned properly. So for me it was strange. It was like listening to Gilbert and Sullivan as arranged by Benjamin Britten, because it was suddenly and oddly atonal on a whole bunch of places, or notes totally missing, which sort of give you breaks up rhythm and things like that. It does to my lay ear anyway. So it was a very strange performance, and yet I loved it because of its offness.
Yes. Well, that's not really the review that you want, but if it didn't detract, then I suppose that's good.
Well, tickets for that show are no longer available.
No, but memorable, clearly.
Yes. Yeah. So let us get us back to Ruddigore as a piece. Now, bearing in mind you hadn't seen this and you didn't really know it, did it cohere, and what did you think of it? Just general impressions.
I really enjoyed it.
I'm delighted to hear that.
Yeah, no, I did. I had no idea what it was going to be about, and I think now that I'm halfway through, as I said, the
Canon.
the canon, yeah, the works of, I'm now starting to realise just how silly these things all are.
Yes.
If I didn't know beforehand, Ruddigore really is the one that underlines that, isn't
Prove
it?
that point.
Yeah. No, it was really good. You mentioned the ensemble earlier on. I thought they did a very good job of keeping the energy up.
Yes.
Which is very important in a small cast piece. And their facial expressions were just as good as the violinists, weren't they?
They were dexterous, I would say, the facial performances. I think I want to mention a couple of them. I thought Madeline Robinson as Rose Maybud was phenomenal. And funnily enough, she turned up, bearing in mind that Rose Maybud, as I say, the topsy-turvy element that Gilbert pops into Ruddigore is he takes all the stock characters from mid-Victorian melodrama and then turns them on their head. So the bad baronet, Sir Despard Murgatroyd, does his crime in the morning, then spends the rest of the day doing good, and is revealed not to be a bad man at all. The young hero turns out to be the bad baronet. The sailor, who is always the hero in Victorian melodrama, is the most two-faced, duplicitous ratbag in the entire piece. He's the principal villain. He's the one who sells people down the river, who breaks bonds, who grasses people up. He's a terrible man, Richard Dauntless. And you have Mad Margaret later on, who turns out to be terribly, she's in the stock characters, but she's not sympathetic, but she is terribly sympathetic. But Rose Maybud is the ingenue character. She's supposed to be sort of unimpeachable, modest, innocent, the principal female love interest. She is a money-grabbing cow. There's a lovely bit. It's one of my favourite bits in the entire canon of Gilbert and Sullivan, whereby she's engaged to Robin, but it turns out he's a bad baronet, so she can't marry him. So she throws herself immediately into the arms of his brother, who was Sir Despard Murgatroyd and is now freed from the curse. And then he says, no, I've got a contract with Mad Margaret. So she then throws herself as the sailor Richard Dauntless. And she actually says, it's a wonderful lyric, Richard, you are the only one who's left, so I art thine. She's going for the best that she can get. And earlier on, there's a song where she's being courted by both Richard the sailor and Robin the farmer, and who are supposed to be half brothers. And they are both trying to win her affection, but Robin wins it because he says, he's a simple sailor, but look, I can give you the farm. And so she goes for that. So she is the absolute opposite of what her character is supposed to be. The stock character is turned absolutely on its head. The reason I mention this is because Madeline Robinson then turns up in the Sweeney Todd a month later, playing the stock character as it should be played. She plays Joanna, the ingenue character, who is sweet and innocent and doesn't have a side to her in the way that Rose Maybud actually does. And I think that's a real testament to Madeline Robinson. And whilst, as I say, I'm picking people out, I thought Charlie Bapty was marvellous as Mad Margaret, one of the most successful Mad Margarets I've seen. And I thought Joe Winter as Sir Rhythm Murgatroyd, who's Robin, because he gets many of the tongue-twisting lyrics, and it's got the famous Very Fast Patter song, which we'll be talking about, I'm sure.
Yes.
But he has great diction, he had great presence, he had great comic face with the dexterity and the comic chops that you need. But also, and we should never forget this, Gilbert and Sullivan is very British. And he could, I suspect he could have walked out of that show and into any Noel Coward show. I'm sure he's much more versatile than that, but he got that. Sometimes you see people who aren't able to do that or having to learn it. He had it absolutely down pat. I would almost argue, and I mean this as a compliment, it doesn't necessarily sound like one, but he's what I would call a nerdist singer. He played that character slightly nerdily, but terribly successfully and professionally. You can see him playing Charlie in Sometimes Merrily We Roll Along. There's a whole set of Avatar characters in a whole set of musicals. The brain box who's overlooked, or the put upon clever boy, and well,
let's be more chill, wasn't it?
Absolutely, that was exactly coming into my mind. Exactly. So he's got a great future ahead of him.
And the casting very much ties in with what you're saying about the stock character of the farmer compared to the sailor, and how the sailor is traditionally more desirable, and against the nerdiness of Rutherford Murgatroyd, Joe Winter, you had the far more kind of
bumptious.
Well, the conventional sailor character,
Yeah.
who was then overlooked. So
Yes, you're right. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
He, in the end, is the only one who isn't paired off with one of the people he really wants to be paired off. He gets the chorus girl, essentially. Possibly Zora from memory, but great name. Begins with Z, which is why I've always remembered it. But I also, and while we're talking about Gilbert turning things on their head, Richard's first song is "We Sailed, You See, in a Revenue Sloop." He's talking about his exploits at sea. So he is part of the British Navy, but they're slightly corrupt in the sense of they see a French ship which they decide they're going to attack for piracy reasons, essentially. They want to rob it. And then they realise it's a French man of war ship. So when they realise they've got cannon and they're going to be severely damaged, they flee. But the way the song frames this very cowardly exercise of being thwarted in the act of piracy by superior French firepower it's that the British troop take pity on the Frenchmen because they know they're going to lose, and therefore that's why they leave them to it, leave them at peace, because they have pity on a poor parlez-vous, as they phrase it. And I love this, and I think it's one of these reasons why you should always really take the effort to listen to a Gilbert lyric, because he's doing that wonderful thing of using words to say the complete opposite of the meaning, which is actually really how British people communicate. There's a lot of documentary evidence about people who come to Britain from continental Europe who say the first thing you have to remember when you talk to anyone from Britain is that they mean the exact opposite of what they say.
Yes. How are you?
Yeah.
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
It's not in a duplicitous way, and also, that we've all done this. You tease your friends. You can be rude and snotty to them. The ruder you are to a chum is actually how close you are to that chum. And we're getting onto another subject, but I love that Gilbert. I think does that so overtly, but it's a very subtle thing to have to be able to pick up.
Yeah, I agree. I must say, as a newcomer, I think the speed of the lyrics, with the music, I was struggling a little bit in places.
And operatic singing also sometimes.
Yeah, but I was finding, like you suggested there, you're having to listen a lot, and you are rewarded for that, like you say. I mean, you get the little gems that pop up every now and then, and actually, in patter songs especially, you can actually, the purists will hate me for this, you can allow a few lines to wash over you and then pick it up again, can't you? So
yes, because you're enjoying the expertise as well as the content. No, I agree with that. Well, you've mentioned the patter song. This Gilbert and Sullivan is odd. It doesn't have the traditional patter song, which is one person singing. It had two originally. Immediately after the Ghosts High Noon, there was going to be Sir Rhythm, as he is by then, Sir Rhythm Murgatroyd, sings a comic song, and Gilbert deliberately put that in because he wanted to break the mood of the slightly more austere operatic Ghost High Noon and that stuff. But he wrote one, and then they cut it, and then he wrote a separate one, and then they cut that as well. And in the end, there isn't a patter song, but what there is the trio patter song, which comes on a little bit later, which is It Really Doesn't Matter, which you knew from something else.
Yes, well, this is, I bet listeners will know what that is. It's the Thoroughly Modern Millie
musical
updated version of it, where the floor wax doesn't matter or something like that. I think they've got out of date floor wax, and when I did that years ago, it was a whole Irish tap number.
But it's the music is just wholesale.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Sullivan.
Oh, it is. It's completely lifted, which I'm sure serves Thoroughly Modern Millie very well, because you've got people who love it in Ruddigore and therefore enjoying that.
Well, it was such a successful song, and has it's the fastest patter song. Let's use the ball term in the whole canon, and it is a masterpiece, and I love it every time. My eyes are fully open to my awful situation. I shall go at once to Roderick and make him an oration. I shall tell him I've forgotten my forgotten moral senses. I shall tell him I've recovered my forgotten moral senses, and it won't. And I don't care tuppence halfpenny for any consequences.
It's not easy.
No, it's not. And I did that at conversational speed and got it wrong.
Yeah.
Of course, it's also, by the way, been lifted when Joseph Papp did his celebrated energy-filled reworking of the Pirates of Penzance in the 80s, which was turned into a film. They also take the patter song and plop it into that. So this is a portable Gilbert and Sullivan song.
Yeah, if you know any Gilbert and Sullivan. That's probably in maybe
Certainly
the top
one of them.
three.
It is. And funnily enough, we're going to name drop terribly here. We bumped into Jake Brunger, writer of the Great British Bake Off, and also Adrian Mole, the musical, with Pippa Cleary. But he was there, and we had a quick chat with him, and he said to us, "What are the big songs in this?" Do you remember that conversation? And you mentioned the Patter song and how it had been used elsewhere.
Well, that's it. I mean, and that just proves the point, doesn't it? That I didn't really know much of the music. High Noon.
And the Ghost High Noon was the other one we identified. Yeah, so let's talk about that then, because there was an innovation in this show. What normally happens is that you've got all these painted portraits on the wall. The lights normally go dark, and then briefly they come up, by which time the piece of cardboard with the faces drawn on it has disappeared, and the actor wearing the same costume steps out, and the ghosts of Sir Rithen's ancestors come out to discuss whether or not he's been a villain enough to honour the terms of the curse they are permitted to live under. And then they sing the Ghost High Noon, because he expresses pity for ghosts. And then they say, actually, we're having a much better time than you think. And then we sing this marvellous song. I mean, it's a great song, the Ghost High Noon. That's what normally happens. Something different happened in this, which I've never seen before. I think was terribly successful. I wouldn't want all productions to do it, but would you care to describe what we got?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very successful, and I'm still surprised that it appeared in this production in many ways.
With slight shoestring production. I know what you mean, yes.
Because I'll describe it in a moment, but it would have taken so much work.
And time.
And technology, and it was absolutely perfect. Anyway, let's describe it. So we had, the back wall of the stage festooned with full assortment of ancestral portraits, and
still... Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, portraits, but paintings essentially. That's what we're meant to believe anyway, isn't it? And during this song, well, the way that they put it together, it's a whole load of portraits based on the actor.
One actor,
yeah,
who's the director as well, I think.
Absolutely. But dressed in all sorts of different outfits to represent his ancestors through the years. And when he is singing to them, they are still within the frame of the portraits, but they've come alive within the picture. So
they're video projections.
Exactly, yeah. And they're all different sizes, and the projection is absolutely precise.
It is.
And it's not a short song.
No.
And, they're moving and interacting all the way through it. And were they joining in with... mouthing some of the lyrics, do I remember? Or...
Well, yeah, they're singing as a chorus.
Yes.
It would normally be a chorus number.
That's it.
That's right. They're singing as a chorus. It's the same actor who's repeated it every time.
That's it. Probably 15 times.
Oh, at least, yeah. Absolutely.
An awful
there were
lot
a lot of
there.
portraits, yeah.
That was one of the most engaging parts of the whole thing, because you could look in any different part of that wall and you would see something completely different, and kind of see him in a maid's hat or all sorts of different things. It's fantastic.
What I will say, actually, there was another joke there which we pointed out, which was the fact that each of the portraits was very clearly wearing a famous Gilbert and Sullivan clothing, because it turned out they borrowed the costume store of the Opera della Luna, who's also the company that put on the Sweeney Todd, the String of Pearls, a month later, and they had bought the old D'Oyly Carte costume store. So the programme said these are the costumes that you could have seen in a D'Oyly Carte production in the 30s and 40s. And so what that meant was you had one of the ancestors who looked very much like Sir Joseph Porter, because he was wearing an Apple's costume. There was another one who was clearly dressed as Dr. Daly, the notary from The Sorcerer. There was another one who was dressed as a beefeater from The Yeoman of the Guard. And that was just an extra, a very nice little flavour, I thought.
Exactly, and to an aficionado like you, that would be an extra little nice thing to recognise.
It gave me a ghost high swoon.
Oh, well done! Still unscripted, fantastic. No, but that was pure theatricality, really. Yeah. And again, just really clever with a small cast. I dread to think how long that would have taken to put together. Even if each one was one take.
Even if, yeah.
And it was spot on.
It was
really good.
And of course they were also doing the eyeline thing. So you had the actor playing Sir Rithen on stage being sung at.
Yes.
So they're all looking down.
That's it.
From different angles.
That's what I mean, yeah. So they'd clearly planned where each portrait was, and therefore I don't know if they had someone off camera kind of pointing where he needed to look each time. But yeah, this whole back wall, just focusing in on him, is quite an image, really.
It really was. And as you say, in a show that had been sort of making a virtue of its sort of shoestring budget, and let's be honest, that was a shoestring budget, it was a coup de théâtre. It did have a slight effect, because the advantage of having actual actors, your male chorus as you would normally have coming out and cowering over, your sort of slightly cowardly, small Sir Rhythm character, does show the power of the threat that they're making, because it's actually the whole sequence is a threat. Do your crime or you're going to die in agony. Whereas when actually only one of the ghost speech marks came onto the stage, because he's plot relevant and comes up later, that's Sir Roderick Murgatroyd. Sorry about the names, everyone. And I thought the power of the threat was diminished, but it was more than compensated for by, as I say, the coup de théâtre.
Yes, and again, as a newbie, to me, though, what it did have was you didn't necessarily believe that these were actual ghosts that are there, but they remained, for me at least, somewhat more in his mind, and it was just the weight of the pressure of the tradition, and because he was basically facing it out to us, wasn't he? He wasn't really looking at them and addressing them, and so to me, it just had the sense of this pressure. They had to keep
almost
doing
like a
it.
nervous breakdown.
Yeah,
that's an interesting interpretation, which I'm going to have to go off and think about. That's a really startling interpretation of something. I was taking it literally because I've seen it so often before. I was just thinking new version. I hadn't stopped to think of it being in a monologue.
Yeah, and imagine living in a place where every day you walk past this wall of your ancestors and thinking, well, they did this, they did that, and now I'm the one who's got to keep the legacy going. That's the sense I had.
I think that's... Oh, thank you, Josh. You well, I'm not sleeping tonight.
You'll be taking the portraits down first, haven't you?
Well, I do have a few portraits up in the house, but they haven't yet threatened me.
Oh, that's good.
Gosh, that's... Oh, right, thank you. You've given me my food for thought for the weekend. That's lovely.
Good.
So I think the one thing before we move on from Ruddigore, I have to say is, and I mentioned this to you, that Ruddigore is the Gilbert and Sullivan which pick and mix, because it was so, not drastically, but significantly rewritten. Songs were taken out, songs were taken in. I've already mentioned the Patter songs, both of which were rejected. There's two overtures. There's the original one that was created by Sullivan when it opened in the 1880s, and then there was the 1920s rework, which is entirely different.
And you were able to identify that within about 10 seconds, I think.
Was. Because what we got was the 1920s one, which most people hold to be better. And it, as a piece of composed medley, which is, of course, what the overture is for a Gilbert and Sullivan in real terms, it is more competent. I still prefer the original one, the 1880s one, which was sort of reintroduced back into the canon for the centenary production at Sadler's Wells in 1987, which was also one of the very first theatrical experiences. That and Into the Woods by Stephen Sondheim were the first shows I went to see on my own because I wanted to see them, and I couldn't find anyone who wanted to go with me. Idiots. But that centenary version was really influential because it reinstated a number of songs that were cut. Including the brilliant what's called the Basingstoke finale, and I said to you, we're going to what we'll get is either the original version, which is we'll get the original version, which is the revival version from the 1980s, which was also the 1880s, or the 1920s version, which is the reduced version with most of the cuts still in it, and the new overture. The new overture came on. I said that we're going to get that. And then all the way through, we got the choices which I associate with the pre-97 1920s version, if you like. And so we didn't get any of the Patter songs pop back in, which you often do now. We didn't get The Battle's War Is Over. So all the way through, I was saying to you, well, clearly what we're getting is what I'm going to call the main version. The main version you'd have got up until 1988, 1987. And then they surprised me by banging on the Basingstoke finale, which I love, and it is better than the slightly insipid original 1920s finale that we've had for so long, and the one I first knew when I listened to the recordings. But it was an interesting choice, and it's a really good example of what you can do with Gilbert and Sullivan. You can this one in particular, you can mix and match what you want, and so we got a very particular take on it, but was idiosyncratic enough to have something that the director wanted to pull out of the revival version. He actually writes an article in the programme about how actually he prefers all these cuts and he wants to keep it short, and he thinks the second overture is the better overture. And there's no wrong answer to this. I prefer the 1987 restored version myself. It's the fuller version, which is why I still prefer that original overture. But we're probably getting into the world of sort of, detail which isn't necessary for this program. It wouldn't make any difference to you, I guess, because you was encountering it for the first time. But I could take you to see another Ruddigore, which would feel the same, but you would say, well, I don't remember that song, and I don't remember that song, and this overture is different.
But I definitely do remember the Basingstoke song,
finale.
Out of all of them. So I'm glad we did have it, because that was one of the better ones. And they kept all the Basingstoke humour all the way through, which was great. So no, I'm quite pleased that my first experience of Ruddigore has been that one.
Yeah, but I do hope that you and I will step over the threshold again and to finish this conversation in the way that we started it, with other versions of Ruddigore. I look forward to further chats with you about any Gilbert and Sullivan indeed, or any show. But I think there's more meat on the Ruddigore bone.
Definitely, I'm glad to have ticked that one off for the time being.
Josh, thank you very much for this really informative conversation. And as I say, it's been not the gift of this conversation hasn't just been your insights, but actually you've given me a brand new interpretation of Ruddigore, which I now need to go off and compute.
Well, same. I'm not sure how much I'd been conscious of that until we talk about it, and that's often the way, isn't it?
Isn't it just? You've crystallised my thinking. Thank you. Josh, I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
See you soon.
Musical Talk. That was Josh Clark and me talking about Ruddigore, or The Witch's Curse, which you could have seen last year, 2023, at the Wilton's Music Hall in East London. A stone's throw away from the Tower of London, assuming you have a trebuchet, and is now a definite stop on the London theatre scene that any theatre goer should try and look at. Well, I do hope you've enjoyed this episode of Musical Talk. It brings our investigation of the world of musical theatre and melodrama to an end. Which means that when we return for next week's episode of Musical Talk, which is episode 851, we'll be talking about something completely different. As I've said before, it is the great wonder of Musical Talk that when the world of musical theatre is as broad and as wide and as deep as it actually is, that Musical Talk can emulate that, meaning that no two episodes are alike, even when we're talking about the same show. Today's episode, talking about Ruddigore, was, I'm sure you'll agree, completely different to the way we've approached every previous episode where we've touched on that show. So without further ado, after this rather a lot of nothing, thank you Mr. Shakespeare, I'm going to bring this episode to an end with the single word which we know will do precisely that. Basingstoke it isn't, but goodbye it is. And therefore it is goodbye. This has been episode 850 of Musical Talk, presented by Josh Clark and Thos Ribbits, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2024. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos. I might ask you just
disavow myself of
clang.
That'll be in the outtakes. I know how you work now.
Yes, well, if it ain't broke.